this is a few days before Christmas, when most people celebrate it in some way, at least especially in the Western Hemisphere. So it's hard not to do a show in some way related to Christmas. We may not do it every year. So next year, if you turn on and instead we're talking about I don't know, Second Temple Judaism, don't be upset. So the very last print issue, this is my understanding of Newsweek, has on the cover Mary and Joseph, sort of figurines of them with little comic bubbles coming out, and they're kind of saying different things about Christmas, which I like the graphics that I saw. I think things like that are interesting, and usually around Christmas these things come out. Christians should be ready for that. I mean, it's a mixed blessing because the culture's talking about it, so we should like that, a chance to engage. But it's also kind of tough because it's generally in the form of an attack or something like that. So we're going to call this show a BART Ehrman Christmas, kind of like a Charlie Brown Christmas, but a lot different. BART Ehrman was the author of said article, and we're going to have two incredible scholars on from across the pond to help us dissect this article, to help us understand some of the issues laid out, and to do that, we're going to bring on some men.
We have two men from the Tyndale House, a scholarly research center. One is Dr. Peter J. Williams, warden. Now, in America, a warden is a man of discipline. So we'll have to hear more from Dr. Williams, what he does as the warden there. And then also Dr. Dirk Jongkind, research fellow in New Testament text and language, and a fellow at St. Edmund's College, to advanced students of the Bible and text and PhDs. And we're fortunate to coming to Phoenix as well. More on that later. But welcome, both of you.
You guys
are be with you
on the air. How y'all doing?
Yeah, it's great to be here. Good morning to you.
Yeah, good morning. So it is the morning time when we're recording the show. It's the evening out there for you guys, correct?
That's right.
Well, thank you for joining us. Now, let's just get right into it. You guys have read the article, and I've heard numerous video and lecture where you've interacted with some of the works of BART Ehrman before. What is the place you'd want to start with for our readers? Perhaps they need a brief introduction to BART Ehrman. Perhaps they need a brief introduction more to your guys' background and training. But I'm going to let you a little bit kind of start how you want, and then we'll go from there. Dirk, Peter?
Well, this is Peter Williams here. BART Ehrman had a very good training in New Testament, doing a PhD in Princeton, and is now a leading New Testament scholar. And he's also, I think, an ex-evangelical, that's how he would style himself, and an agnostic. And he's been writing a number of things which have been really attacking the historicity and reliability of the New Testament. His speciality is the manuscripts of the New Testament, although he's not as knowledgeable on that as my colleague here, Dr. Jongkind. But he has a pretty wide set of writing, and he's recently written attacking the reliability of the Gospels as to the narratives of Jesus' birth.
Yeah, Dr. Williams, isn't it true really that Ehrman hasn't done really any advanced work in textual criticism actually in a while? It's been lately more popularizing and things on the historical Jesus, even though people kind of look at him as this go-to guy in textual criticism. He's not really at the cutting edge, I don't think. I'm not saying he's not a world-class scholar, but is that accurate to say that he's sort of recycling a lot at this point, perhaps?
Well, what I think you can say is that often the people who are really at the cutting edge don't have much of a public profile because they're spending all their time at the coalface, gnawing away, and so on. And there are different disciplines relating to the text of the New Testament. Some people study the way early church fathers quote it. Some people will look at the manuscripts. So Dirk Jongkind was the curator of Codex Sinaiticus, so he can tell you about a manuscript he's really worked with closely. BART Ehrman, actually, for his PhD, studied the way someone called Didymus the Blind, who's a church father in Alexandria, quoted the New Testament. Now, one interesting thing about Didymus the Blind is, of course, he never saw a New Testament manuscript in his life. because he was blind, he'd probably have memorized most of the New Testament. But starting with that as a starting point to look at how reliable the manuscripts of the New Testament is, that would give you maybe not the best representation.
All right, so what is the substance, what is the main sort of thrust Dr. Ehrman puts forward in this Newsweek article? What do we really know about Jesus?
I'll leave to Dr. Jongkind will go for that.
All right.
Well, as I understand the article, two things are going on. The first one is that Bart Ehrman has a clear agenda to sow seeds of doubt. There are some insinuations here and there, and by portraying certain viewpoints, by introducing them with certain words, there is a kind of the doubt sowing without actually putting your argument on the block. So that's one thing. The other thing is the main thrust, that there are more Gospels from the early time than have been included in the New Testament, and that some of these Gospels may actually give us additional information which is not found in the canonical books of the New Testament. And Bart Ehrman does not really elaborate on this claim, but he goes into quite length into one of the so-called Gospels, the Proto-Evangelion of James, where he tries to explain how some of the stories there may look ridiculous because they strike us as odd, but perhaps are just kind of run-of-the-mill Christian myths.
So this Proto-Evangelion of James, the article really begins with his summarized version of it, and in it, it's this elaborate, I would say clearly embellished account of the pregnancy and of Mary and the birth of Jesus and things like that. And Ehrman runs through it and then says, now this sounds fantastical upon first listen and upon first reading, but if you think about it, so are the gospel accounts of the nativity found in Matthew and Luke. So he brings out this ridiculous thing and then just says, well, just because you're used to these, you don't think they're goofy. But indeed they are. But what is the difference between Matthew and Luke and this, what I think late second century, work that doesn't seem to have any eyewitness input into it? What are some of the differences between them?
Well, I think there are several differences. Let's just take Luke for a moment. We can test Luke's reliability at other points in terms of his knowledge of the geography of the Mediterranean and the customs and the names of officials in various points. So that's something which is in favor of Luke and Acts together, which is not in favor of this proto-gospel of James. Then we also have what we have in Luke's narrative is he talks about shepherds being in fields in Bethlehem. Well, we do know that shepherds tended to shepherd near Bethlehem. You could say he got that from the Old Testament, but the Old Testament only really tells you about one shepherding family, so he does know the local geography. Then he comes out with the fact that Caesar is registering the entire world. Well, one thing we know about Roman emperors is they are interested in taxation. I mean, what's the point of having an empire if you're not going to milk it? They're there in order. That's the point of growing the empire. So that's a very plausible thing. And even his mention of the swaddling clothes famously uses a word which is particularly common in medical terminology. So it fits with Luke being a doctor. There are things about the account which make sense. Of course, it doesn't mean we can prove it in some sense of it being corroborated, but it's perfectly plausible in what it says, in those sorts of details. And I don't think we've got that in favor of the proto-gospel of James.
So we see that now in relation to the worldwide census. In a manner of speaking, Ehrman specifically brings that up and attacks it. Now, on the other side of the break, guys, would you be willing and ready to talk a little bit about his specific critique in regards to the census? Let's talk a little bit about that, because that's a specific thing he mentioned, saying it's not corroborated.
I would like to enter a couple of ways. First of all, we know that taking a census was quite a regular thing within the Roman Empire at last. We have census records from Egypt, kind of a Roman province in those days. And as far as I can remember, they had a census there about every 10 years. And then if you look at Augustus, his testament, it is normally called the Res Gestae. It's a very long inscription found on several places in Asia. And there he describes that during his reign, 3 times he counted all the Roman citizens there were in his empire. And he gives the figures for how many citizens there were at those 3 occasions. But what's interesting is that we are talking here about Galilee and Judea, which were, strictly speaking, not even part of the Roman Empire. And though Ehrman gives the impression in his article that they were just full-blooded part of the whole Roman Empire, strictly speaking, they belonged to the kingdom of Herod the Great. And Herod the Great was a client king. He was a friend of the Roman Empire. But Herod the Great was responsible for his own taxation, for his own managing affairs. So it is actually quite interesting that here we have a mention of a Roman census, though the normal pattern would be that Herod the Great would be responsible. Now, if you go through all the Roman historians with a tooth comb, you find that at some points there was clear tension between Herod the Great and the emperor in Rome. And at one point, the Roman Senate even voted to give Herod a less privileged status than he had before. So the title of friend of the Roman Empire was taken away from him. And at that point,
he unfriended him.
The Romans were stepping in.
It's like de-Facebook.
Yeah, it's like the ancient version of unfriending someone on Facebook.
Yeah. Although it had some political consequences here in this case.
It wasn't just about updates.
One of the political consequences may well have been that the Romans took charge of taxation and took that away from Herod. So it didn't last long. Herod got back in charge fully, and he amended relationships and the whole thing. But it may well have been in one of these periods that the Roman census actually took place.
So you're saying there's a historical anomaly in the sense of why would the Caesar be the one in charge of taxing Herod's region, but you're saying there's a historical background, a context in which Luke's scenario is very plausible because of the specific circumstances of them getting temporarily unfriended on Facebook in the ancient world version of it. Is that correct?
I think that is exactly correct. But of course, here we are 2,000 years later, we don't have all the information we would like to have. So part of the problem is when we look at the political situation of those days, when we look at all the information that is given to us in the Bible, in the New Testament, in Luke, then we see that there are things we would have liked to know, but Luke simply doesn't mention them.
I think there's another factor I'd want to throw in, which is we do know something about migrations. And what you have in Luke is Luke tells you of this couple going from Nazareth down to Bethlehem. So they're going from Galilee to Judea because Joseph came from Judea. Now, that's highly plausible because we know that several generations before the time of the New Testament, there were big migrations from Judea up to Galilee. So the idea that some people in Galilee have their family in Judea is, again, that fits with what we know of the time and place. Someone living in another country and just making up stories probably wouldn't have known that. The fact that they are so different at least shows that the gospel writers haven't been colluding in what they've written. It's very interesting that if you want to be skeptical, you have to choose one of two routes. Either the gospel writers know about each other or they don't. If they don't, then it's quite striking that they both mention Jesus being born in Bethlehem. And so you could say they're two independent witnesses to it. Yeah. And if they do know each other, then, of course, the contradiction argument doesn't work so well, because if one's writing with the knowledge of the other, presumably they know there's a way of fitting things together. Mm-hmm. So what I'd say is the biggest tension in the genealogy would be if we take it that both are giving the genealogy of Joseph rather than Mary, how can Joseph have two fathers? Because you have two different fathers mentioned in Matthew. Joseph's father is Jacob, and in Luke, his father is Haley. Well, of course, nowadays we do know that people can have two fathers, one a legal father and another a biological father. And here's a scenario. Imagine that Joseph finds that Mary is with child. He's wondering what to do about it. He's thinking about divorcing her quietly. And so he asks his dad, what should I do? A little while later, he goes to his dad and said, I'm not going to divorce her because an angel's appeared to me. And so I've decided I'm going to take her. At that point, of course, Dad says, you're not my son anymore. I'm ashamed of you and what you're doing and so on. And then, of course, his legal father might be someone else.
Dr. Williams.
So you can easily imagine if you a scenario in which you'd have a different legal father.
Let's pick this thought back up on the other side of the break on a BART EHRMAN Christmas. Yeah, the event is sponsored by Tyndale House, the Gospel Coalition, Phoenix Seminary, and Camelback Bible Church. So you should know it's going to be good. If you're in the Southwest, you got to come.
Yes, I think really the difference between Matthew and Luke, the main difference would be that that Joseph has two different fathers, whether it's Jacob in Matthew or Haley in Luke. And I think you can easily imagine a scenario whereby, because of of Joseph being prepared to take Mary, even though she's pregnant, to marry her, you can imagine a situation in which his biological father might well disown him, and he'd have more than one father. He would have a legal father in that scenario. That fits. We could also say that Luke didn't get his names for his genealogy generally from the Old Testament, not for the key period back to David. And yet what he doesn't do is put embarrassing names in like Philip, 700 BC, which would have been a big embarrassment, a Greek name before Greeks were around. Easily, if he were just taking common names at his time and making up a genealogy, he could have done that and fall into a big blunder. He didn't. So I think there's good evidence for the genealogy.
Yeah, let me interject here. I mean, I want people to stop sometimes and take a step back and look at these arguments, because you may be thinking, well, I can't catch all this. This is really detail-oriented. How can I repeat this? Just stop for a second. Do you think that if the genealogies didn't have any kind of discrepancy, meaning there are two different names listed there can be viable explanations for that, but let's just say that didn't exist. Do we think BART EHRMAN would then therefore believe the virgin conception of Christ? Is that what's going on here? Or is there subterfuge about picking this, picking that? I just want people to understand it's not like we answer this and all of a sudden, oh, now I believe the account. They don't believe the account, and then these things are brought to the attention to say, oh, look at this, look at this, look at this. But the real issue is what's going on in the account. A Savior sent by God himself. In fact, this Savior is the God-man, and there's miracles in the narrative, and that's the real problem. I do think that needs to be brought out, the bigger picture of it. Any comments on that? We only have about a minute and some left on this segment, but I don't know if you want to speak on perhaps the presuppositions in the worldview of guys like Dr. EHRMAN.
Historians are very good in explaining the logic of history when there are parallels or analogies and when there are known causes. Here we have a situation where all the known causes and analogies come from outside our normal history. They come by direct intervention from the divine. And that makes this area so difficult to assess for normal historians, because the normal methods don't really work as well.
All right, so we do hold to a God who acts in history. And we see that through and through God's Word. Now, when we come back, believe it or not, we only have one more segment left with Dr. Peter Williams and Dr. Dirk Jongkind of Tyndale House in Cambridge in the UK. And they will be coming here in Phoenix. We're going to put the link up when we put the show up, and so you can come to the Can I Trust the Bible conference as well. See you on the other side of the break.
When people are in an ancient society, when there isn't a major disruption, there tends to be a very large level of continuity of a family living in a particular place. And so the idea that David's family has been in a place for a very long time and that people in that locality can trace their genealogy back is extremely plausible. It wouldn't require mass migrations because most people do stay in their families. I'm not saying that the text has to be read to say, that everyone's making mass migrations, but there are some particular families who know where their roots are, and I think a family descended from someone like David would be more likely to know where their roots were than anyone else.
At the end of that quote, it says, no historian from the time just brought it up or something like that.
Right, he brought, yeah.
So apparently Luke cannot be included as a historian of any kind for whatever reason, but he's excluded from that. Right.
Yeah, I think that there is a problem there. Everyone knew he came from Nazareth, but if people made up the story that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, I'd like to know when they made it up. Because in the first 30 years, you have family members who are prepared to lay down their lives for the faith. And after the first 30 years, Christianity has spread so far and fast, it's very difficult to make up a new birthplace for the founder. So I think it is problematic to have the idea that Jesus is born in Bethlehem as a late invention. We've just got the two accounts, Matthew and Luke. And Luke tells us at the beginning that he's not an eyewitness, but he's checked things out with eyewitnesses. And I think that's very interesting. It's very honest. He's not trying to claim otherwise. And of course, if he's around interviewing people in the 50s or early 60s, then he's in a good position to talk to someone like Mary even, and some people who are around early on to get that sort of information. We know that the information that he gives for the early history of the church, he's really done a lot of research on. He gives us the most detailed account of any ship's voyage in antiquity, and so on. So we know he's thorough. And so it's not that we can corroborate everything he says, but there are certain points where we can corroborate what he says, and so it's reasonable to trust the rest.
So when you guys first read this article, I mean, what were your thoughts? I mean, did you think, oh, there goes Bart Ehrman again? Were there new things? Were there things you're like, uh-oh? I mean, when you see these kinds of things, help us to gauge how our reaction should be. And when you guys look at it with your background and training, what do you think when you see this in Newsweek?
Well, it sounded to me pretty much like a run-of-the-mill article with the same old usual arguments basically based on alleged contradictions, on the implausibility of the whole story. And when it comes to the implausibility, I would agree. I mean, it's so implausible that God himself would come to earth in the form of a baby. So, but if you accept that great implausibility, then some of the others, I mean, if you look back on your own life, there are so many implausible events. And people's lives normally don't develop by the highest probability, but by very low probabilities, actually, by cutting-edge events and the whole thing. So that implausibility argument I've never found very persuasive. Perhaps the new bit in this article is that Bart Ehrman tries to make the extraordinary events within the canonical Gospels stand on the same type of level as the extraordinary event described in the proto-Gospel of James. But to most people, actually, birds standing still in the midst of the air is a different type of miracle, a different type of counter-natural event than some of the things that are going on in the early chapters of Luke and Matthew.
Yeah, so he tries to put them on the same plane in a way. But, I mean, yeah, it is interesting, the textual tradition, meaning the manuscript evidence we have for these Gnostic or proto-Gnostic or these embellished, really ultimately, I think, non-Christian works under the guise of Christian works, like the Proto-Evangelion of James. I mean, what do we have? Usually 1, 2 copies. Often it's fragments. Often it's translated. I mean, I don't know the exact history of for James, the work he brings up, but they talk about these with such regularity. But then when it comes to the New Testament, well, we have no idea what the original authors really said, even though we have a preponderance of copies, especially of Matthew and Luke, and some that are very early. Do you guys detect a double standard sometimes when a guy like an Ehrman interacts with some of the materials, especially in regards to the textual tradition?
I think to take the proto-gospel of James within this article is actually a clever move, because proto-gospel of James was very, very popular throughout church history, actually. But it's interesting that there's never been kind of any ban from the church to deal with or to address the issue proto-gospel of James should be forbidden or whatever. It has always been kind of tolerated as some sort of a, what shall we say, Christian novel, Christian fantasy. If you would go into the average Christian home and you would have a look at the children's Bibles that are around, and the details added and the romanticizing that is going on, then we are roughly talking about the same kind of thing that was happening in the early Christian church as well. So we don't know the function of the proto-gospel of James. We don't know why it was written as it was written, but it was never probably intended to be part of God's revelation, which is found in the agreed canon.
So it's like the comic book Bible of the ancient world. But, yeah, I mean, James is a little bit different than some of the flat-out Gnostic ones. This seems to be sort of Jewish a little bit in some of its embellishment. I don't know. I mean, I have read it. But it's interesting because the Roman Catholic Church, there's been actually a lot of Roman Catholic piety that's developed out of this because the focus is on Mary and some of the names given and some of that. And so, yeah, I see what you're saying about it being a clever move. But, I mean, I hope people can see the clear difference between these kind of works and the sort of sobriety and historical groundedness in Luke and in Matthew.
Also, because the Christian faith is based on the fact that we have a God who revealed himself in history. Mm-hmm. When God revealed himself, he did not give kind of 12 articles of faith about himself. Yeah. He revealed himself through leading the Israelites out of Egypt. He revealed himself by giving kings, by giving prophecies that came into fulfillment. And he revealed himself by the actual historical event of coming into this world and dying on the cross and rising from the dead.
Do you have any other questions you want to sneak out from that article?
Well, I think it illustrates lots of things. And one of them is how much, if someone's in a secularly prestigious university, they can get instant access to the media, and that story will just run. The initial scholar, Karen King from Harvard, didn't do enough homework before she went to the press. But she had some cautions about what she said. The first press dropped some of those. Then you get the next lot of the press that drop even more of those. And then you get to by the time you get to public understanding, there's just a vast difference between that and the reality. So almost certainly this this little credit card scrap, is a forgery. I even have a friend who thinks he knows who forged it. And although that can't be said yet publicly, but But it is one of those things that, in a sense, it fed the appetite. People wanted to hear that Jesus had a wife. I think next thing they'll be writing that he had a husband. But it's just, it fits with what people want to hear.